and take it away.
This one is working.
This one needs attention.
Here you go. It's already on, so.
Test. So this is working?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so yes, I'm Carl Soderlund. I currently work at Athene. I've been in IT a long time. I think there's some people here who've probably been in IT longer than me. And I'm going to be talking about Finops and basically how do we align engineering within the Finops space. Who here has an idea, or feel free to shout out, what do people think of when you hear Finops? What? Okay, what'd you spend? Financial software, okay. So those are good answers. And here's my agenda. I should have gone to this first. So, FinOps overview. Personas is an idea that's the FinOps Foundation. So it's a nonprofit that tries to advance understanding of FinOps and operating in the cloud and the financial models associated with that. I'll talk a little bit about the cloud spending shift and why this, and that's part of why this is important. I live in the AWS ecosystem. Things I'm talking about apply regardless of what cloud provider that you're working with. And I'll talk about some multi-cloud resources. And then I'll give some examples of dashboards that we have implemented at Athene that are AWS specific, just to kind of give you some insight into tools that are available. So FinOps Foundation defines FinOps, it's a practice, it's not a tool, it's not a software package. It's really supposed to be collaboration between people within the organization so that there aren't any surprises. And it is something that you have to iterate at. So, in FinOps Foundation, and I'll keep referencing to them, they're kind of like the reference point where you can get all this information. But they talk about this idea about crawl, walk, run. Okay, you don't need to be doing, FinOps like, a Fortune 500 company who has all of their stuff together. If you're in a small organization, there's still things you can do. And the FinOps Foundation, like I said, exhaustive coverage of all things FinOps. And I'll flip over to their webpage on occasion. I do have some QR links at the end for some of the sites that I'm going to reference. But the first idea to kind of look at here is, what persona are you? So do we have any people here who would be considered leadership? This could be a CIO, CTO, could be a director within IT. It's usually somebody who's responsible for a budget. Are we all developers today? Okay. Finance, they're the ones who are mapping those costs to internal cost centers or budget lines. Procurement, they still get involved with purchases. It's not like it used to be back in they're not good, they're not bad, the old days. You could be a product owner, okay? You care about how your product's operating. Maybe you're not as focused in on the cost side of it, but you usually should be aware of the cost implications of what your product, costs to the company, and then what value it provides too. Then there's engineering. And engineering is why most people in finance and leadership, as we've made the transition into the cloud, lose sleep at night. Because the cloud changed how we procure stuff. And I was talking with, I think it's John, right? Before the meeting. When I first started in IT, we had, a data center, we had racks of machines. If you had something new you wanted to build, you hoped you had capacity in there. If there wasn't capacity, okay, now we need to get approval to buy a new server, new piece of hardware. That has to go up the chain, either to the CIO, maybe the CEO, to say, okay, yeah, this is something that wasn't planned for in the budget. Finance is involved, procurement's involved. Everybody's aware that we're buying new hardware. Now, any one of us in this room or within your organization can type a few lines of code, deploy, and now you've got a database server stood up. So we get the benefit of the ability to iterate and build the immediacy of what the cloud provides to us. But at the same time, when you spin up a database server, do you go tell your CIO? Okay. Have you ever had somebody in leadership come back and say, why did the costs in this account go up by this much? Because it's been running at this rate for months, and like the cost is double. We didn't plan for that. So that's part of why the Finops Foundation got started and why Finops got started. As an engineer or a developer or DevOps, whatever you want to call it, we have the checkbook. We don't have to ask mom or dad to buy something for us. We can just go do it. So speed goes up, guardrails go down, and you need some sort of feedback loop so that the people at the top of the organization who are responsible for those budgets know what's going on. And I mentioned this earlier, I live in the AWS ecosystem. These concepts apply everywhere. So I may use terminology you're not familiar with if you're working in Azure, or if you're working in Google Cloud, or if you're working in Oracle Cloud. Okay. So the example I have here, AWS has reserved instances and savings plans. Azure has reserved VM instances, I think what it is. And Google has committed use discount and reservations. 3 different names for things that are all technically the same thing. And if you go to the Finops Foundation website, these would all be considered committed usage discounts. So that's another thing the Finops org does, is they try to map what are the general terms, names we can use regardless of who we're working with when we apply to these types of ideas. And they have a whole page of stuff. So this is on their website. They have this whole page of Finops terminology. And they've got all sorts of things that you may or may not have experienced in the cloud. Does anybody know if you have like anomaly reporting enabled within your environments? something goes haywire. There's some poor error handling logic. Something gets stuck in a loop and runs continuously, and it's only supposed to run for 5 minutes. And the next day you come in, and instead of your, I don't know, $200 a day run rate, you rang up $14,000 the previous day. Okay. And in here, they also have this section on public cloud terminology. And this is where we get down into, where is it here? Commitment discounts, sorry, wrong section. And be expanded, oh, and you can't see that because my PowerPoint, I am so sorry. I don't do presentations that often. It's all Jonathan's fault. What was that?
I said, I know there's to be a detention. Jonathan gets it.
Check what?
It's probably a second screen to get connected.
Oh, I got you. Display. HDD display. There we go. All right. So this is the Finops Foundation page. A whole bunch of stuff on Finops terminology. When we get down to commitment discounts, which you can't read, they talk in here about GCP committed use discount, AWS reserved instances, Azure reserved instances for VMs. So these concepts apply everywhere. And if I get back to there. Also, if you have questions at any time, feel free to ask. So if you want to be paying attention to this stuff, there may be somebody in your organization already doing that, but as a DevOps engineer, developer, there are tools that are available to you. AWS has cost and usage data exports. You can set those up. They have 3 of them. One of them is really just the line item, every single charge that occurs over the course of a month, a day. Depends on how you have it configured. Cost Explorer is a user interface tool. It lets you log into an account. You can group things by services. You can filter different services out. And it's a real handy, quick place to go to look at what's my spend in this account if that's what you're responsible for. And then there's Cost Optimization Hub, which is a list of recommendations. Hey, here's a database server that hasn't been connected to in 14 days. Do you really need it running? Azure has the cost management and billing interface. It presents some of the same information. And then Google, you have billing reports, and you can export those to BigQuery. That's just data. And it's a lot of data. So like a month's worth of AWS bills is, well, I know Azure, there's usually like 2 million to 5 million rows in a month's worth of data in the data set. AWS is the same way. This probably should have been somewhere else. You can get that data into 2 different tools, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. I did want to make sure I mentioned this. Who here is tagging resources in the cloud? Okay. See a few hands. What kind of tags are you using? You can just give me labels. You don't need values. GitHub. What? Okay, GitHub, so a service.
Owner?
What?
Owner?
Owner, yep, that's who is responsible usually for that resource, those charges.
Environment?
Environment's a good one. Is this, dev, production? You can also put things in like, if you have an internal construct, we use the idea of a budget line. That's really kind of what cost centers within the budget do these costs map back to. You could even have, what?
Repo name?
Repo name, okay. That's good because you know where was this resource defined. From a Finops perspective, tags can be used for, well, I don't need to read this to you. It's really a way of how you can you can map the resource back to a repo, so for the development side of things. But if you're not tagging things, and it depends on how you're set up. So if you're in Azure and you have one subscription and everybody's stuff is in there, and you don't have tags, it's just one big bill. Who owns what part of that bill? And so, trying to think about how can we use tags to actually say whose spend is this becomes important. You can do it by leader. You can do it by cost center, like I said. Tags also allow you to have meaningful dashboards and reporting. Because if you tag stuff, those tags show up in the data sets I had 2 slides ago. So in your cost and usage report in AWS, if a resource has a tag on it, it shows up there. So now you can throw that into your query system of choice and say, give me all the rows, total the value for this particular tag. And it's also the foundation for automation and optimization.
Can I ask you a question on tagging? So we're trying to figure out the best way to tag. Either we maintain the tags on all of our assets, or we point all of our assets to like a CMDB and pull the information from there. It's just a endless nightmare of keeping tags up to date, and someone has to own it. So we're in a point like we're getting ready to stand up a CMDB. So do we use API calls to point to the CMDB to populate the tags so the CMDB is the source of truth, or do we maintain tags, maintain at the CMDB? Like how does the theme handle tagging?
So I'm pausing here with a slight smile on my face because this is everybody's problem, okay, when it comes to tagging, is what's the source of truth? Do you want the source of truth to live in your code base? Do you want it to come from another system? Regardless of where it comes from, it needs to be maintained. So you can set up, you can set up a CMDB, but if nobody's updating that as changes occur, you're in the same place as if nobody's going back to the code base and making changes. So I don't know that there's a right solution. What's really important is what works for your organization. So if you have commitment to maintain the CMDB and that linkage is easily established, that's great. There's other things you can do too. So if you're in Azure, for example, you have multiple subscriptions. If you can tag the subscription, and everything within that will inherit those tags. The same thing in AWS, you can tag the account, and everything within that account will inherit those tags. So then your account boundary becomes a financial boundary when we're talking about FinOps, or an ownership boundary. So there's different ways to approach it. I don't know if I gave you the answer you wanted,
No.
but
I've asked multiple people the same question, and there's not a good answer. Just what do people do?
it's maintaining it and what makes sense to the organization. Me as an engineer, I really shouldn't define, how we do our tagging strategy. But me working with all those other personas I talked about, where we can collectively come up with what are the key things that we want to be able to use to like roll information up. That's where, the value comes from. And then the logistics of how you put it in will be unique to the organization. So the next slide here talks about, okay, we've got these big pieces of data. How can we dissect them? How can we take the data and make information out of it? And these are considered to be kind of the same tooling across the three providers. In AWS, they have QuickSight. It's a dashboarding tool. It has a lot more capability than that. It's been rebranded as it's a component of what they call Quick Suite now, since they've been renaming everything. In Azure, there's Power BI and the Power BI app. They have built-in reports, templates, and things that work with their billing exports so that you can actually get information. And then in Google Cloud, you've got Data Studio and Looker Analytics Dashboard. I have absolutely no experience with that. My wife is learning the ropes of that. And the reason I mention my wife is because we used to work together at Athene, and she kind of ran the Finops operation. So she's got the Finops Foundation Certified Professional designation. It means she's studied a lot. She's not a finance person, but she understands their language. And she's working with Google now. So I get to hear about all that all the time. There's additional data to help power decisions too. So the items I was just talking about tend to look at, the billing information. But billing information just says, what does this cost? When you start collaborating to try and find ways to have cost avoidance, avoid costs, you really need metrics on, okay, I've got this, VM or RDS instance, or I don't know, containers within Kubernetes and Google Cloud. What resources do I have allocated to that? And am I actually using them all? And like I said, I come from back in the day when we used to have an infrastructure team who had all of these metrics, kept track of it, noticed when things were getting tight, would purchase additional capacity. But they also helped tune things in so we don't have this capacity that could be used by something else locked up in a resource where it's doing no work. So actually getting into the metrics of your resources, what's your container efficiency? If you have a database instance, how much, are you keeping track of what your freeable memory is? Do we have any DBAs in the room? No? Okay, freeable memory is basically, database server has this much memory available. That's how much memory the database has available that it doesn't need. So in the cloud, usually you don't see memory utilization for databases because the database is going to take all the memory on the compute instance it's on and allocate it for its use. So freeable memory is the metric you look at. And if your variable memory never goes below like 80%, 80% of the resources tied to that database aren't doing anything. You know, oftentimes people think that, you know, well, it always is busy, it always runs this slow. Yes, but you've got 80% of capacity you're paying for 80% of capacity you're not using. So understanding, you know, kind of the infrastructure side, in addition to the code that we're writing, is important. And so this is one area why when we have a regular cadence of meetings with teams where we look at what their spend is, you know, what they're planning to introduce into the environment. Part of my job is to do a bit of an architectural review and say, okay, we looked at, you know, these resources here, and you've got all this excess capacity that we're paying for. That circles back to the project team, though, because unless you get a story into a sprint to actually do something about it, it's not going to change. So this is where, you know, the product owner and those other personas come in again, because we want people to be able to go in and take action on the information that's being provided. Otherwise, you know, you just keep running at the same rate and you usually have the same waste. So, I mean, it's multi-layered and multifaceted. Any questions? I don't see anybody falling asleep yet. All right. So we're not to the end, but I mean, the big thing I was hoping to get across to this point is it is a shared responsibility. You know, as an engineer, I have a responsibility to pay attention to what I'm deploying, and is what I'm deploying, you know, configured in an efficient manner. Finance has a responsibility to, you know, allocate the spend to, you know, either through showback or chargeback. Leadership, they have a responsibility to just manage the budget. And one of the key principles from the Finops Foundation is that finance can't own Finops. Engineering can't own Finops. It really is a joint effort. And I don't know for any of you, but, you know, in my organization, there's things that I see as, you know, architect, engineer, where it's like, why is it configured this way? And, you know, lots of times people don't have good answers. You know, the goal is to actually start looking at that stuff. And a lot of times it does take involvement from leadership, you know, to say, okay, let's pause and look at what we have. So building those relationships is really important. Because if, as an engineer, you know what to do to fix something, but you're never allowed to do it, you know, that's not a fun place to be. Especially when at the end of the month, somebody comes, you know, knocking on your wall saying, why is this expensive? And then you say, well, it's the same thing I told you last month. Invisibility builds trust, having the conversations, dealing with the hard questions, the awkward questions, the uncomfortable questions, and being able to answer and give evidence. So you're not just saying, well, it costs this much because of like our nightly cycle. Okay. It costs this much because we need this much capacity during a nightly cycle, and our design doesn't allow us to scale up or down. which then will come back to, well, how can we accomplish that? And, you start getting stories created, work coming in to address the issues. And iterate continuously. I think I mentioned this earlier, there's this idea of crawl, walk, run, okay? If your organization gets all gung-ho about doing FinOps, no matter how much energy they have, you're going to start out crawling. And that's okay. It doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It just means that it's, something that kind of needs to get ingrained as a discipline with people. So this is the Finops QR code for the terminology page I showed earlier. I don't know if anybody wants to capture that. But it does a good job of covering like the finance terms and explaining it. I don't know if anybody in here has tried doing, has done a net present value calculation, cash flow, where's your break-even point on something. Usually the finance people do that. But as engineers, knowing what goes into the process and being able to rough it out can be very beneficial. It also helps when you need to get something additional or buy something more or get more capacity because you're talking their language. And when you're talking their language, it's a lot easier. I really wanted some people from finance here. But I can do this anyway. So if I told you that I found something in our configuration and I was able to make a change and our monthly bill went down by, let's say, $5,000. What would most of you consider that? I mean, good, but like what word would you say to describe that? If you're telling somebody, I did this and it resulted in probably savings, right? For people up at the top and in finance, savings has nothing to do with run rate. It's whether you're above or below budget. So you could reduce your, well, it's true. I mean, the financial definition of savings is coming in, it's the money that it's being below budget. So, terminology, and that's why this slide is here, is important because when you're talking to somebody in finance, saying we have this much savings, I've done that in the past, and they're looking at me and like, that's not savings, and I'm thinking, what are you talking about? It's money we're not spending. It's because it means something different within the context of their area of expertise. So this page can be really important to help people communicate together when you don't have the same background. Now, is this going to actually switch? Okay, I got to get out of PowerPoint mode. I now understand why people I've seen do presentations do this all the time. So down here we've got finance and accounting terminology. And I admit it's not real exciting to me, but it does help me speak their language. And it also explains some of the acronyms they use. Another good one is unit economics. One thing the cloud can make really, one value the cloud can add if you're doing tagging. Let's say you have everything tagged and you have certain systems that are involved in the production of some item that gets sold. It could be an insurance policy, an annuity. It could be a tractor, okay? If you produce so many of those items over the course of a month, and you can actually see the cost. Now we've got a unit cost that makes sense even outside of IT to like the salespeople, your business partners. So there's a lot of different things that can add value even aside from, how much are we spending?
Before you move on, I have a question. Sorry.
Yes, go ahead. I like questions.
If I'm picturing the Venn diagram of this terminology, it would mainly be GAAP accounting overlaid with cloud computing as it relates to each other. This is not insurance specific, correct? Like this right here?
None of this is insurance specific,
Thank
correct?
you so much.
These are terms that are common in the accounting and finance world.
Yep.
It may not apply to the way that your organization looks at stuff. But I work for an annuity company. Okay? How much do all of the systems and everything we have contribute? We know how much those systems cost over the course of a month. How many annuities did we sell over the month? How much money from a technology and hardware standpoint, and this isn't looking at people and staffing and that kind of stuff, but what's the infrastructure contribution to the cost of what went into producing that annuity?
Are you doing chargeback and showback? Either or?
We do showback.
Are you finding that when you've done showback, now they want to control how you use your resources?
I don't. So I'm mostly within I operate within IT and with IT finance, and I'm not high enough up on the ladder where I'm talking with our business counterparts. So I have no real insight into that. But I know what we're doing is valued, the way that the stuff that we're doing within my sphere of influence.
Yeah, I was just kind of curious if like the concept of DevOps starts to deteriorate when someone sees the line item directly hitting them, as opposed to it being we all are sharing the costs of the infrastructure in an old way, right? And finance is just responsible for depreciating it over time.
I think there's a little bit of that, but there's also systems where, you may have a system that's like not cost efficient, but it's mission critical, and they don't want you to do anything to it because the risk potential to operations or something could be very disruptive. And that's part of the the personas idea. Again, AWS world, AWS well-architected framework. They've got the pillars, architecture, reliability, financial or cost management. You can't have all of those up at 100% with everything. Anything that you put out there is going to be some balance of that, because if you get 100% reliability, that gets real expensive, and the added reliability may not necessarily be worth it to the business. So that's a risk appetite of, yeah, it might go down, we can deal with that. You can make something really, really cost efficient, but then it becomes brittle if there's like a spike in business because it can't handle the additional load. So it's a balancing game. And that, again, is why we want as many voices at the Finops table as we can get, because we're making trade-offs. And if people are aware of the trade-offs, then you can avoid what you're getting at, where it's like, okay, this costs this much, you need to get that down. If we have good insight into what the implications of lowering that run rate is and can communicate that, then it's like, okay, yeah, if we do this, here's some risk that, yeah, we don't want to do that. Or maybe something like, okay, that sounds like a good idea. And then it makes its way into your sprint as a normal story. Or it comes in as a normal story, whatever language you use at your organization. And gets handled with everybody aware of what's happening. But there's a lot of good information on here. There's another page, which I'll follow the link for as soon as I found my PowerPoint button. Come on. Click. There we go. I personally like this site. So this is multi-cloud tools and terminology. So you remember where I had the, AWS has reserved instances and savings plans, and Azure has reserved VMs. This is where all that stuff is talked about. And I need to get out of my presentation again. I need to do this more, Jonathan. I'm just giving Jonathan grief. And where, come on, mouse. Where are you? This is where bad eyesight doesn't help, too. There we go. Let's go to keyboard shortcuts. And let me, did I make it any better? So here they're comparing, there's a mouse, different services within the cloud providers and what they provide. So, cost plane. Google has a pricing calculator. AWS has a pricing calculator. Azure has a pricing calculator. Oracle has a cost estimator. I talked about, AWS Cost Explorer. It's in the console. It's real easy to use. There's parity in some of these areas. The tooling's different, works slightly different. But here are additional things that fall into that category. So, Google has some additional elements here. Billing export to BigQuery, detailed billing export to BigQuery, so you can have even more data to sift through, and pricing export to BigQuery. AWS has cost and usage report, all of these things here. This is, the data where you're getting stuff. Azure just has the usage and charges report. Is anybody here in Oracle? You don't have to answer that if you don't want to. Is anybody here in Oracle? You don't have to answer that if you don't want to. And here's where we talk about the detailed billing analysis. So we got Data Studio or Looker Analytics in Google, QuickSight. I mentioned Power BI and Power BI app. Invoicing, forecasting, tagging. You can go see what things aren't tagged and which things are, and whether the tags are accurate. Template-driven deployment. Are you deploying your infrastructure and everything via code, or are you doing ClickOps? They both have their place. And then controls. So you can put guardrails in place. So you can try and prevent somebody from, I don't know. I'm just trying to think here. Like, I would be really scared in my organization if somebody stood up AWS Aurora, what would it be, like an R8 24 or 48 XL instance, That's a lot of money. You can prevent that. And then there's recommendations, and then insights. And the insights here, CloudWatch and CloudTrail, I use that more for kind of data-driven decisions around capacity personally. And then here's a bunch of like 3-letter acronyms, links to the different resources for the cloud providers. So if you want to grab that QR code, we can do that. I've really been talking for 50 minutes. I tend to think out loud. I apologize for that. So this link has all of that information. And then the last slide here, it's a tool that we do use. It's QuickSight based, and AWS has branded them. It's from their the well-architected labs arm of AWS. And I already have it pulled up, so I just need to get out of this. So this is the site. Try making this a little bigger. So, did that get bigger or smaller? What the heck? Okay. All right. So out of the box, if you decide to look into this, there's several dashboards that do a really amazing job of presenting your costs. And the nice thing with this site is they actually have demos of them. So this will have to load because it's loading some data from the back end. But I spend a lot of time talking with teams from this screen. It breaks everything down by service. So you can see the costs. In here, that's EC2 is this example's big spend. Another thing to pay attention to is you can filter out different charge type groups. So if you want to see what your spend is in absence of any refunds or credits or discounts, that's kind of a level floor. Because you can't always guarantee that those things are going to be there. So, sometimes organizations will exclude that from the view, even though that's not what shows up in the ledger, just because, those can be variable things. And they've got some built-in controls. Yes, sir. Oh. So there's a couple of different things that we look at. One is what's been their historical spend. So let me go back to the graph over here. I have bad ears, so I will walk over if people ask questions. So like we've customized what we've done here, because this is like a 6 or 7 month look back. So we actually see 12 months internally. And so you can see the variability, or what the rate that the spend is increasing at, or if things have been relatively flat and last month there was a spike. Okay, if there's a spike like that, that's usually when we want to have a discussion about, okay, did you add something new? Or, what was going on? And then you start, it's not really a root cause analysis, but you start digging into the weeds to figure out, okay, what happened? So I find this valuable. Um, Teams find it valuable. They don't always do anything things about it, but and there's different elements here. So this graph here is showing your savings and discounts. It has lots and lots of tabs. So if your executives don't want to see a bunch of numbers and stuff, there's more of an executive view here. There we go. There's an executive's view. If you want to dig into the details on, well, then there's trends. If you want to look at your compute costs in detail, there's a compute tab. So they've broken it out. You've got your summary view, and then you can look at individual pieces of what your spend are. And I don't work for AWS. I'm not marketing this. It's just something that we found valuable. There's other dashboards, and I can select them straight from here. Cost intelligence is okay. If you want to set up KPIs for goals, like on being at particular types of processor architectures just because of performance, there's a KPI dashboard. I won't go into that in a lot of detail. The TAO dashboard is short for Trusted Advisor Outlook. So Trusted Advisor is a dashboard specifically that looks at the well-architected framework pillars. So there's a summary, but then we see security. That's one of the pillars. And security health checks, cost optimization, that's another pillar. And there's a lot of data in here. One that we found useful here more recently, where is Cora? You also look in the drop-down, I don't know if you can see it, but AWS is trying to help you understand your other cloud providers' costs too. So they actually have dashboards that AWS has designed to consume your Azure billing exports and your GCP exports that provide similar information. So if you are in a multi-cloud environment and you primarily use AWS, you can pull that other information and see it there. And then there's the Cora dashboard. This one's very useful. This is the cost optimization recommended actions dashboard. So these actually are actionable items that people could take in this example. List effort, the savings estimate monthly. So this can help you look for, where's low-hanging fruit. Where can we get a lot of savings, but it's, very complex or real easy to get. It'll show you things, and again, I'm speaking AWS terminology here. Sometimes developers will stand up an EC2 instance for doing some testing on, and then they tear it down, but they forget to delete the disk. So this will show you like all the unattached EBS volumes. Yes?
Do you have any methods, or do you ever try to find costs that a trusted advisor might not pick up, savings, other methods, anything else that escapes the normal cloud-provided reports?
So, yes. But that's where like multiple hats start coming into play, because you need the architectural view, and you need the security view. So there's things that, and it's on both sides. I mean, there's other situations where we know something's really inefficient, but we can't do anything about it because the vendor won't support it unless it's this big. So there is a feature where you can do like Finops exception tag, and it just won't show up on here. But yeah, I mean, every situation you can think of occurs. And it's all situational. But yeah, where is... If you're running Kubernetes in AWS or ECS, they have a dashboard for that too. So you can come in and view by a namespace or, forget my Kubernetes terminology, pod, different dimensions. And this one's useful because this little blue line that nobody can see, that's what's your container efficiency. So that's a score of, are you saying this container needs this much memory and this much CPU, but you're not using it? But it's tools like these, and like I said, I don't have experience with Looker Studio or Power BI, but there's probably similar capabilities, or you can build it so you can actually see, take the data, turn it into information that then can lead to action to try to, get in better alignment. Yes?
I'm just curious, I mean, I think if you're in the DevOps, you've gotten like an email or something like that that says like, hey, your spend is abnormally large for this period of time, and so it ends up, well, we find something misconfigured or whatever, we fix it. I'm more curious, like, what do you guys do? Like, if there's like, can you go get a credit or something like that on stuff, or how do you work with the cloud providers? And I'm just curious what you do on things where it's abnormal spend because of some glitch or whatever.
So you can always ask for a credit. It doesn't always work. And it really comes down to, I mean, if you put yourself in a cloud provider's shoes, is this something they could have controlled? Is this something that, was it misconfiguration on their part? Or was it bad programming logic? Because a lot of those situations, it's kind of like, well, train your people better.
Do you like have a discussion like responsibility and like is it 100% the customer's fault, in which case you eat the cost, or is it something where it's a shared responsibility where you split the cost or something like that? I just was curious how that works.
Yeah, I mean, a good example was, there was the AWS Route 53 issue late last year, where it took down like EC2, so like all their compute systems went down, Lambdas weren't able to scale, all this stuff. Okay, AWS had a problem. In that situation, the playbook for that is, you need to be able to demonstrate a loss of business because of that outage, quantify it, and then send it to them. And, if it's well documented and it's clear, usually you'll get, they'll take responsibility for that. But that's a really painful exercise to go through, because you're like tracing stuff from infrastructure to, your distribution channel. So sometimes you can get a credit, sometimes you don't. I would say if you think it's something where, if you think it's an honest mistake and you've taken corrective measures to prevent it, like made a code change or something like that, that's something worth bringing to them. But you can't count on that actually turning into anything.
I was curious, because, I mean, we get that, and then back to this one situation, it was a code change to fix it. And so as soon as we were made aware of it, a lot of times this is a little black hole sometimes to us, like what the real bill is.
Yeah.
But as soon as we're made aware of it, we found the issue and was fixed within 1 hour. But
Yeah.
what do you do? I mean, I'm just curious what you guys do on your side.
We dig into it. So a valuable tool at AWS is you can, and again, sorry, it's all AWS. In AWS, you can set up an anomaly monitor within your payer account.
And we've been getting some anomaly, like one of the things we've noticed that recently, there's some anomaly detection emails coming out. And we investigated that and come to find out it was just after Christmas. And so the anomaly detection was based on Christmas break time. And then when we got back, loads went up dramatically because everyone's back to work.
Yeah. And that's where, the holistic view of your organization comes in.
Yeah.
But this, if you don't have anomaly detection turned on in whichever cloud provider you're in, you should turn it on. You'll get false positives. That's okay. But when there's something that happens that results in the cost from one day to the next, is 20 times larger, you find out right away. So you can take action and not burn that additional money. And in those situations, that's where, being able to dig into the code, being able to dig into, what all does whatever had the problem talk to. Sometimes it's not anything in your code. It could be an outside vendor or something that you pull data from, and they had a problem on their end, and that problem trickled into your environment.
And do you see like DevOps teams like utilizing these dashboards so they can, do it effectively or more directly, or are they more oriented where like Finops it sends out emails and alerts and sets all that stuff up, and then they don't do anything or look at it actively?
My experience is mixed, okay? So just like how I said, there's that crawl, walk, run mentality. Within teams, within an organization, some of them will be running, some of them will be crawling. Some of it depends upon, the load that they're under,
The team and
Right. But we have one team in our organization that, they've got everything dialed in. And, they pay attention to all their alerts. And, it was funny, there was, what was it? It was like the end of March one year. And, the vice president came over to me and it's like, okay, we have a 10% price increase. And it's like, yes, that's because March has more days than February. So you can't always look at monthly totals. That's why being able to spread things out into like a daily view can be more valuable too. And those are things you need to account for when you're setting thresholds for alerts. It's a complicated puzzle. I don't do this full time. I've been an assistant to somebody who did it full time. And like that person's developer. But it's made me a lot more aware of everything that I'm doing. And it's valuable because, if you never show up on the cost naughty list, it's a good place to be.
I did notice that one of the other things that, in addition to the trend anomaly detection emails, that in PR requests, there's now a check to look at your Terraform code and estimate your increased cost or decreased cost based on
Yeah, there's several tools that do that. You can hook, I think there's one called InfraCost stuff that'll do that. I'm not sure like what your deployment platform is, if you're using like AWS native tooling and things, but there's lots of things that can provide you that insight. But again, those are estimates. They're close, but
Like most things, we kind of consider things like a little funny, we don't
yeah.
know the actual real cost that is negotiated on a contract with like the cloud provider, but we can always look at the cost estimator and get a rough idea.
Right. And the tool space is constantly expanding, and people are adding more functionality. I know I'm out of time. Jonathan's looking at me over there. But does anybody else have any other questions? It's maybe not the most exciting DevOps topic, but it's important. And your organization's leadership and people you work with, in my case, they appreciate people paying attention to it, and they notice it. So it's really valuable in my mind. One last question, anybody?
How do you prioritize which team to go knock on the door? You have a bunch of teams that are all over budget. Is there do you have a system that you use, or how do you kind of determine who gets talked to first?
We have a regular cadence with all teams, and so we try to treat them all the same. But like I said, we've got teams that are at a different stage of paying attention to these things. So I'm less worried I'm less worried about when I talk to the people running on that scale of crawl, walk, run than I am for people who are newer to cloud. Because they're new. They're going to make mistakes.
So you're saying focus more time on the first group of people, the crawl group, and helping them understand what's going on, or is it the same?
I'm just trying to. I pause when I think. People wonder if I have a stroke. What we do is we try to use the information we have available. And so if there's something that's obvious that can be done, and it's like a big cost reduction, a big opportunity for cost avoidance, we'll go talk to those people. You eventually get to a point, though, where instead of being, big bang savings, you're really talking about marginal savings across a group of accounts or a group of services, which are relatively small. But depending upon the size of your organization, if you have 200 accounts in AWS or 200 subscriptions in Azure, and each of them have $50 they could save, which from a financial budget standpoint individually is not that big of a deal, but you multiply it by 200, that's $10,000. So again, it's very environment dependent. But I just encourage you all to talk to the finance team, talk to your project leaders, that kind of stuff. If you see something that could be improved, tell people.
I kind of think of it as like an ownership mentality. Are you just there passively working on the team, or you have an ownership in pricing the app or whatever you're using, so that you use use the resources wisely and efficiently, and don't be wasting company resources and stuff.
Right. And if it's something where you see like a potential issue with another team, you know, don't do, I don't know if they even still use the term, you know, an end run and tell upper management, oh, so-and-so is doing something bad. You know, approach them and say, hey, I noticed this. You know, have you considered, you know, making some changes because we might be able to get your costs down, or we might be able to improve the efficiency of the system that you work on. Like I said, it's meant to be a collaborative effort. It's not one where we're butting heads, we're not pointing fingers and blaming people about things. It's really, you know, educating people and helping upskill them. Because as a developer, you know, when I first started writing code, I didn't look at any of this stuff. It wasn't something that, you know, I thought I needed to consider. But it's, you know, as more and more stuff goes to the cloud, and even with AI, I mean, if you want to see a bill go skyrocketing, you know, have a poorly constructed, you know, training model with AI. That will rack stuff up. And Finops Foundation has a completely separate like certification around AI, just because it behaves differently than the systems that we're used to working with. I think I should stop, but if there's more questions, feel free to ask.
Yeah, thanks, Carl.
Okay.
Just real quick, 2 announcements. So if you saw when you came in and got pizza, there's that poster about the Code and Collaborate event on March 9th. That'll be, I think, here at Source Allies. We're working with a couple other local user groups, so love to have you come out for that one. And then we are still planning to have a meetup next month, March 25th. Cecil Williams has figured out some ways to do effective like Terraform testing. I'm not really sure what that looks like, but he's going to share kind of what he's found. So if either of those events interest you, we'll have that link. You can sign up there on the Eventbrite. Otherwise, for our March 25th event, we'll have a meetup page up for that. But yeah, otherwise, feel free to take a pizza. We'll have extra. I'm sure there's extra over there. So if you want to take one home, take it. Yes. So, and then feel free to stick around and just ask Carl questions or just chat amongst everyone else. But yeah, thanks everyone for coming.